Have you ever felt like you need a secret decoder ring to figure out how these huge policy decisions in Washington actually, trickle down? How they impact your life, your job, maybe even healthcare for your family? It can feel like a lot.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really complex landscape, policy is.
Yeah.
And getting a clear picture, like what's actually happening versus what was meant to happen, well, that's tough. Finding unbiased info on the real outcomes, very challenging.
Right, and that's exactly why we're here today doing this deep dive. Our whole mission is to cut through all that noise. We're taking this stack of sources you sent over healthcare news, economic reports, government docs, even some social media stuff.
A real mix.
Yeah, a real mix. And we're pulling out the key nuggets. We want to give you a clear, well-informed picture of recent policy moves, things like economic policy, regulation, social programs, without drowning you in information.
We'll try to connect the dots, look at the different angles from these sources so you can understand not just what's going on, but maybe why it matters, in the bigger picture of our economy and society.
Okay, sounds good. Let's kick it off then with something that's often pretty controversial. Medicaid work requirements. Our sources are definitely pointing to a renewed interest here, especially thinking about President Trump's return. So what's the thinking behind this push?
Well, looking at the sources, there's a clear emphasis coming from, conservative policymakers. We see Republican governors mention McMaster in South Carolina, DeWine in Ohio, actively going after federal approval for these work requirement plans.
Yeah.
And in Congress, Republicans are looking at these sort of as a potential way to cut federal spending. The stated goal, which pops up a lot in the sources from proponents, is really about promoting employment, personal responsibility, and making sure Medicaid kind of aligns with the idea of the dignity of work.
That intent seems pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But, often with these big policies, how they actually work in the real world is, it's a different story, isn't it?
Yeah.
What did the sources show about how things played out in places like, say, Georgia or Arkansas?
Yeah, that's where you really see the wrinkles. So take Georgia's Pathways to Coverage program. The sources show that while it was, designed to encourage work, they ended up proposing some big changes, things like the monthly paperwork for proving work hours and the premiums. They were going to get rid of those. And interestingly, those parts were never actually fully implemented anyway, which kind of highlights maybe some early roadblocks. They also broadened the opt-outs, like for parents with kids under 6, sort of acknowledging the practical side for caregivers.
And Arkansas. Didn't they have a program before that ran into some legal trouble?
They sure did. There was a federal judge, James Boasberg, who ruled back in 2019 that approving their first program was, his words, arbitrary and capricious. Basically, he said it didn't focus on Medicaid's main purpose, providing medical coverage to people who need it.
Right. That's a big hurdle.
Definitely. So Arkansas's new proposal, it tries to get around this. It suggests not making people report work hours directly. Instead, they'd use existing data, things like income, job history, education level, to see if someone's meeting the requirements.
Okay, so using data they already have.
Kind of, yeah. And crucially, if someone looks like they're not on track, they wouldn't lose coverage right away. Instead, they could get into this success coaching program. It really seems like an attempt to address those past legal issues, keep people covered, at least for a while, but still push towards the work goal.
That is a fascinating adjustment, trying to keep people connected. But it does bring up a question that comes up in the sources. Do these requirements actually match how people work today? Especially people in, trickier situations.
Well, a lot of critics, like Laura Colbert from Georgians for a Healthy Future is mentioned, argue they really don't. She points out that programs like Pathways often miss the mark for people in the gig economy, or the informal economy, people who might not have neat pay stubs every month.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And beyond that, the sources highlight other groups, caregivers looking after older kids or elderly parents, older workers finding it hard to get jobs, people with medical issues. They might still get locked out, even if they're trying their best to contribute somehow.
And the data. Some of our sources mention data from previous work requirements, like in TNF, that's temporary assistance for needy families.
Yeah.
And it sounds pretty stark, linked to increases in deep poverty. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, deep poverty, as the sources define it, is living on $2 or less per person per day. Really extreme hardship. And the numbers cited are quite sobering. One source points out that the number of households with kids in that kind of extreme poverty jumped from about 636,000 in 1996 to 1.65 million by 2011. It's a striking point. Policies meant to help people become independent could, in practice, end up creating these huge administrative burdens for states and real hurdles for people trying to navigate them, sometimes pushing them deeper into poverty. It's a complex outcome, kind of the opposite of the stated aims.
That's powerful and really counterintuitive. What else do the sources say about who gets hit hardest by these policies?
The sources are pretty clear that these requirements tend to disproportionately affect certain groups. We're talking people with disabilities, people of color, women, LGBTQ individuals, older adults. And here's another really interesting insight from the data presented.
Okay.
It suggests that most adults in programs like SNFP, Medicaid, housing assistance, who are considered work capable, well, they're already working.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So that kind of reframes the whole discussion, doesn't it? It suggests maybe the issue isn't so much a widespread unwillingness to work, but more about, barriers to finding consistent work, or maybe just the difficulty of documenting that work in the way these rigid policies demand. Makes you think about how effective they really are versus the stated goals.
Okay, so let's shift gears now. Moving from social programs to the wider economy. Let's dive into some of those big shifts in economic policy, specifically thinking about tax cuts and deregulation. A huge one here was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA from 2017. A real cornerstone for the Trump administration, right? Supported by figures like Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell. What was the main idea behind it, according to his supporters in our sources?
The core idea, as presented by proponents in the sources, was really twofold. Simplify the tax code, make it easier for everyone, and B, kickstart the economy, get robust economic growth going. There were even claims, you might remember, that it would essentially pay for itself through all that new growth.
Right, the pay for itself argument.
Yeah, it was really grounded in that supply-side thinking. Yeah. Lower taxes on businesses and individuals should incentivize more investment, create more jobs, and lead to overall prosperity.
So, breaking it down, what did this actually mean for you, the individual taxpayer? And what about for corporations? What were the key changes?
Okay, so for individuals, the big headline was nearly doubling the standard deduction. Think $12,700 up to $24,000 for a married couple filing jointly.
That's significant.
It is. They also got rid of personal exemptions, but they doubled the child tax credit to $2,000 and made $1,400 of that refundable. But on the flip side, a lot of those miscellaneous itemized deductions went away, things like tax prep fees, union dues, and a really big one, it repealed the individual mandate from the Affordable Care Act.
The requirement to have health insurance or pay a penalty.
That's the one. Gone.
And for corporations, what were the major changes there?
The biggest change was moving to a flat corporate tax rate of 21%. That was down from a tiered system that could go as high as 39%.
Wow.
Yeah, big drop. And the U.S. also shifted to what's called a territorial tax system. Basically, companies mostly pay taxes in the country where they earn the income, not necessarily on all their global profits. Plus, there was that one-time tax break on profits held overseas, the repatriation tax, designed to encourage companies to bring that money back home. Lower rate, 8% for non-cash, 15.5% for cash.
Okay, now this is where it gets really crucial, I think. Let's compare the promise versus the reality. The promise was growth paying for itself. What did the data actually show about the economic and fiscal impacts?
Well, our sources lay out a bit of a mixed bag, leaning towards not quite meeting those expectations. The Penn-Wharton budget model, for instance, estimated GDP might be a little higher by 2027, maybe 0.6% to 1.1%, but, and this is a big but, it also predicted a huge increase in the national debt, somewhere in the range of $1.9 to $2.2 trillion.
Trillion with a T.
Trillion with a T, and the Congressional Research Service. Their report found, quote, a relatively small, if any, first-year effect on the economy. They noted that company profits, pre-tax profits, grew faster than wages, and there wasn't much growth in wage rates for typical workers.
So that claim about the cuts paying for themselves.
Yeah.
What was the final verdict fiscally?
Yeah, that didn't really pan out according to the sources. Federal tax revenues actually fell, and the deficit got wider. This wasn't really a surprise to many economists, actually. One source mentions a University of Chicago survey where, 37 out of 38 economists polled believed the act would rapidly increase the national debt.
Almost unanimous.
Pretty close. And you had 4 Nobel laureates in economics, Stiglitz, Krugman, Thaler, Deaton, all publicly speaking out against it, raising major concerns.
So beyond just the dollars and cents, the debt figures, what other criticisms did our sources highlight?
There were several. Concerns about worsening income and wealth inequality, for one. Also, interestingly, that the tax code might have actually become more complicated in some areas, potentially opening doors for, tax avoidance strategies. And even international issues, some countries raised objections about potential trade distortions. Shows how these domestic policies can have global ripples.
This really does all tie back to that core philosophy, supply-side economics. Can
Yeah.
you just give us a quick refresher on what that theory argues?
Sure. In essence, supply-side economics is the argument that lowering tax rates and reducing regulation gives the private sector better incentives. Incentives to work, save, invest, which then leads to more jobs, higher productivity, and just more economic output overall. It's about boosting the supply side.
Right, and this theory got that famous voodoo economics label from George Bush Sr. back in the 80s, didn't it?
Yeah.
When he was running against Reagan. He was talking about the extreme version, the Laffer curve idea. What is the Laffer curve and what actually happened after Reagan's big tax cuts in 81?
Yeah, the Laffer curve is the idea that if you cut tax rates enough, it could actually increase government revenue because the economy would grow so much. More activity means a bigger base to tax, even at a lower rate.
Seems appealing.
It does, but the sources we looked at state pretty clearly that the evidence after Reagan's 1981 cuts flatly contradicted that hypothesis. Budget deficits actually exploded, went from around $74 billion in 1980 to over $220 billion by 86.
Wow.
And studies found that the response in terms of people working more or saving more was minimal. The key takeaway here from the sources is that the estimated effects of tax cuts on labor supply and savings just usually aren't big enough to generate enough extra growth to make the cuts pay for themselves. Plus, a lot of savings are already in tax-sheltered accounts, limiting the impact.
Okay, so beyond taxes, the Trump administration also really pushed for federal deregulation. What were the claims about its impact, and do our sources give examples?
They do. The Council of Economic Advisors, the CEA, under Trump, put out reports with some pretty big claims. They argued that deregulation had raised real incomes by about $3,100 per household per year.
$3,100.
Per household per year. And saved consumers and businesses around $220 billion annually. Their argument was that cutting regulations increases competition, boosts productivity, raises wages, and lowers prices for consumers.
What kind of examples did they point to?
Our sources mentioned things like price drops for wireless and wired internet after an FCC rule was nullified, and also significant savings on health insurance premiums, like over 50% in some cases, for people switching to less regulated short-term health plans. The CER report also framed it by saying Obama-era regulations had created large annual net costs, sort of justifying the push to deregulate by highlighting that perceived burden.
All right, just to round things out, our sources briefly touched on a couple of other policy debates that were gaining steam, even if the details on their broader impact weren't as fleshed out in what we reviewed. First, this no tax on tips idea.
Yeah, that popped up. The Tax Foundation perspective, highlighted in one source, argued against creating special carve-outs for tipped workers in the tax code. Their point seemed to be mostly about fiscal responsibility, wanting to keep the tax base broad.
Okay. And lastly, there was mention of legislation like H.R. 7511, which apparently allocated billions for border wall funding.
That's right. While the source material didn't really dive deep into the economic or social effects of that specific bill, its mention definitely shows it was a significant federal spending priority, part of that larger policy picture.
So wrapping this all up, what's the big takeaway here? It really feels like policy decisions are just incredibly complex, don't they?
They really are. And the effects ripple out in ways that are often hard to predict, touching everything from your healthcare access, your personal finances, right up to the whole national economy. To really grasp these shifts, you absolutely have to look past the headlines. You need to dig into the details, the data, and really consider all the different viewpoints and, critically, the actual outcomes on the ground.
Couldn't agree more. Whether the goal is, promoting personal responsibility with work requirements, or trying to juice the economy with tax cuts, or aiming for efficiency through deregulation, these different paths don't just shape the economy now. They really shape the underlying social fabric, right?
Yeah.
The opportunities that are available to people, to families all across the country.
Exactly. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought for you listening. When you consider everything we've talked about today, the stated goals versus the real-world results, what do you think is the ultimate way to measure if a policy is successful? What's your benchmark? And thinking about that, what other questions does it make you ask about the information, the sources we've explored? It's definitely something challenging to chew on, but pretty essential when you're trying to make sense of it all.